special guest today, who I will unveil in 15 minutes or so. But we thought that would be a fun change, and it's not really that different. It's not like a interview or anything. It's just one other person who joins the water cooler. So, what should we talk about? Oh, so we have a couple of things to talk about, but I wanted to start by asking if anybody watched the Disney sing-along last night. Anybody watch that?
We put it on DVR because our kids can't stay up till 9 p.m. So,
I know, that was kind of odd how late it was.
So
it's
tonight, we're gonna watch it tonight, at least half of it.
Yeah, it's quite good. I don't know. I'm always very impressed when you see like Disney flex its muscle a little bit, right? You just get a bunch of like big, moderately big or some very big stars to just like do stuff and put it on TV and have people watch it. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, content and a commercial are almost one and the same thing, right?
I know, it was amazing. I blew my kids away. I was like, oh, and Disney owns ABC too. And they're like, what? And anyway, so all right, let's talk. Maybe let's talk a bit about COVID. Taiwan seems to have won the global tournament so far in terms of handling COVID. No new cases. I don't know if they've had any new cases later this week, but Melody, you're the most.
Yeah. 2 days ago they had 0 cases, and today, or I guess yesterday, Taipei time, they had 0 case again. But it's not like they have that consecutive days with 0 cases, but at least they had 2 out of past 3 days with 0 cases. So that's good.
That's pretty good. So yeah. What are they doing right that everyone else isn't?
Well, I mean, I think one is that for people who, so I was in Asia when SARS happened, and everybody got hit pretty hard by SARS. And I don't know if Rob, you remember, Hong Kong was pretty bad as well as Taiwan and Singapore and a few other countries. And I think because of that experience, the government actually set up an entity, unlike here, where they actually have a lot of direct authority when it comes to pandemic style response. So that was very helpful because they sounded alarm end of December, early January, and they were able to quickly activate that. So they didn't have to go through a lot of political red tape that we have to go through here, as a bit of an uncharted territory. So I think that helped a lot. And they activate. I think the other thing is they started early. They started doing certain types of border control and lockdown even before the first confirmed case happened in early January. And they started doing daily press briefing from the government 3-4 months ago, ahead of everybody else. So I think like starting early, so they were able to do very aggressive contact tracing, and every person that come in from international travel, imported cases they call it, that they are able to really be able to identify people who are in touch with. And then it also helps that they have a universal healthcare kind of national healthcare program, so they can join the data with custom and travel data. So they are able to identify people fairly quickly. I think certain things that is probably not as replicable here because we don't have a universal health database, for example. And I think the threshold for privacy and personal freedoms is a little different, even though Taiwan is a democratic society and has a fairly, it's a kind of in a different bucket than some of the other more dictatorship driven society and environment. But I think the big thing is just early and being really high alert, because they suffered a lot from SARS like 10-15 years ago. And wearing masks, which has been a thing even before COVID became serious.
I think it's pretty interesting how quickly like comfort with masks has at least that's my sense, at least in the Boston area and the Northeast, like folks are getting pretty comfortable with masks. The town of Brookline now is requiring it apparently for if you go outside your house. So
it feels
I think
weird. I know you're in the grocery store though, and it just feels everyone's masked. It just has a different presence.
Yeah, it does. But I'm curious to see how long it takes for this just to become a new normal. And I think people are incredibly people adapt really quickly. So we'll see.
So is it in Massachusetts? Are people required to wear a mask now in public, or just Brookline?
Brooklyn was the only town that I saw actually required it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are wearing masks when I actually haven't gone outside very much, but it's relatively prevalent. I don't know, what's it like for you, Dave?
A lot of like the grocery stores that I've been to, they require it I mean, they have big signs on the outside. So whether it's, whether it's government mandated or store mandated, it's kind of social pressured.
Yeah, actually, we have a bake shop here. Even before Cuomo required everybody to wear a mask starting today, there's a bake shop, and the entrance to the door says, if you don't have a mask, you can't come in.
Yeah.
So it's pretty aggressive, but it's the right thing to do, I guess.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see how obviously there's the response to the controls is pretty varied across the country. And it's actually not that surprising, like when you look at the data. So I had a tweet earlier this week that talked about, if you look about the number of new daily cases relative to the size of the population, Singapore, which is considered, a country that really has its act together, but they shut down the economy over there a couple of weeks ago. They're at something like 6.8 new cases per day per 100,000 people. I was actually pretty shocked to see, Massachusetts is at 18, so quite a bit more than Singapore. Texas was at 2.5, so way below Singapore. Florida was at 5. I don't know what the numbers are recently. This was a couple of days ago, but it's so easy to think that your what we see, your own purview is representative of the whole country, but it's like vastly different. Let's talk about some business news. So you guys saw, I know this is pretty hot on Twitter, but Outback Steakhouse, there was a interesting, they made an announcement that they were not going to lay off any of their workers. They weren't going to furlough anybody. They were going to offer free meals to, any of their employees that needed it. Pretty commendable move. Curious what people thought about that.
Before we talk about the move, what do you think about, are you pro Bloomin' Onion or are you anti Bloomin' Onion?
The best.
Best. Even with, and going in that it's 70% margins, gross margins.
Well, is that, it's not like I'm making one myself at home.
That's the right lens when it comes to what to order at restaurants. Like, can you make this at home? If not, you should order it.
Right. So it's not a margin thing. I mean, you're a Blue Apron, so it's not a margin thing. It's can you make it at home?
That's how I usually think about it. If I see something on the restaurant menu, I was like, oh, this sounds like something I'd make, then I won't order it. I try to order weird stuff or things that I know for sure it's hard for me to make.
Well, it's because of those margins that they have $300 million in cash.
Well, that's actually not that abnormal, because most publicly traded restaurant groups have 6 months of liquidity and cash buffer. So that's actually pretty. I would say it's more expected than not. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounded like they were burning something like $8 to $10 million a week, and that their business was down 60%. Is that right? Something like that?
Yeah, something like that. So I was actually, as I was mentioning to you earlier, I was chatting with a friend who happens to be a public analyst covering the restaurant space. So I was asking her, I was like, hey, what do you think about this? Is it a good PR move? Are you worried about them, liquidity crisis or whatnot, given their burn? And one thing that she said is actually pretty obvious, but interesting. I didn't notice at first. He's like, the statement of no furloughing or layoffs is actually kind of misleading, because most of these restaurants workforce is hourly. So they're not actually full-time. And if you have reduced restaurant hours, by definition, your hours get cut, without you actually needing to furlough. But her point of view is that, it's all about, like, so long as you don't think that they will go out of business, and, they're not going to be burning at that rate because they have a lot of leverage when it comes to renegotiating rent. And even though Blooming, for example, is one of the more levered restaurant groups, banks are actually giving them a lot of flexibility when it comes to interest payment as well. So you're not gonna hold the 8 to 10 million at a steady state burn rate and just like multiply that, 30 weeks, and then you're done. It's going to be a combination of, like, they can assume some kind of sales ramp, right, in the next 30 weeks or so, and then you can also assume that they can be able to cut that burn further. So I actually think, I think it's more of a positioning thing than that it is a good PR positioning for them. Not to say that they don't have good intent, but I actually don't. Public equity people don't really see that as a liquidity crisis.
Interesting. Did you hear? I don't know. I didn't look at this, but do you know how their policies are comparing to other sort of large restaurant chains?
Sounds like it's not out of ordinary, and because I think, again, it's because of, like, the statement, maybe the free meal stuff is a little more unique, but I think even before COVID, most restaurant workers get subsidized or free meals from the restaurants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the no furlough statement is actually just what it is. It's not like they're actually doing something dramatically different. And there's probably varying degrees of measure depending on whether your sales are down 50 to 60% versus 30 to 40%. For example, Dunkin' Donuts, they're down 30 to 40%. Sit downs are down like 50, 60%. So their wiggle room is going to be a little bit different depending on the type of restaurants that they are.
Mm-hmm. Scott just asked if Outback if Outback has asked for concessions from their landlords. Do you know that?
I don't actually know exactly, but according to what my friend has studied, that's expected. Like, the landlords are actually giving concessions because they don't have any alternatives. It's not like they kick Outback out and they can get a tenant that pays rent.
I was gonna say, you could be like Cheesecake Factory. Cheesecake Factory said we're not paying rent. So
yeah. But it's interesting because she's like, well, her fund owns stock not in Outback or Blooming, but in Texas Roadhouse, which is kind of in a similar category. But Texas Roadhouse actually owns most of their real estate, so they don't have a lot of pressure from the rent perspective, and they have no debt, so they're less levered as well. So I think those are all considerations when it comes to, at least from the public market perspective, and like what kind of liquidity squeeze you might or might not have.
So I should take this opportunity to say, if anybody wants to ask a question or mention anything in the chat, feel free to do that. Just ignore the circus that went on in the very beginning when it was totally unpoliced. And we'll, if appropriate, we'll try to get on that. Why don't I introduce our guests? So we are lucky to have Andrew Parker here with us as we continue our conversation and probably shift more towards tech and startups. So we were very clever and coy and tried to give hints to his identity. So, the hints we gave: second generation venture capitalist. So, Andrew's dad was a VC, part of the investment team at 2 of the top performing funds in the last decade. So he was an early member of the team at Union Square Ventures before joining Spark Capital, where he was a GP. He created one of the most often cited VC infographics, and that is the unbundling of Craigslist infographic that countless pundits have referred to over the years. And 4, he was a Series A investor in a product that almost all VCs and many, many founders use, and that is Carta. And we'll talk about that company a little bit. So Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rob. If I die of
How are you
COVID, I
doing?
hope you give my eulogy.
What was that?
If I die of COVID, I hope you give my eulogy. That was a great intro.
If this VC thing doesn't work out, I guess that's, I don't know if there's a job for that. So what have you been up to, man? You've been running a lot.
Yeah, my Strava is very happy. I'm hanging out sheltering in place in Calistoga. It's like an hour and a half north of San Francisco, and really lucky. I mean, just a ton of outdoor space, and I know there's a lot of people out there in way less fortunate situations than, being able to hang out in Napa Valley or whatever. But yeah, so running a ton, and I'm on a farm property, so I've been learning like beekeeping, and like we're tending to the chickens, and gardening and all this stuff. It's kind of like a whole outdoorsy experience. It's really quite
Are
cool.
you with like a mini community that's sticking together, or are you there solo?
No, I started dating a woman. Her name's Laura in like August last year, and it's been going great. I'm really excited. We're really happy together. But we're hanging out in LA for a couple of weeks, and the day that we were going to return to San Francisco, where we both live, was the day that shelter in place was announced. And she sadly lost both her parents early in her life, and inherited the home that her father built up here. And so this is a place that we go occasionally on weekends, whenever. We're like, yeah, Calistoga is gonna be a lot better place to shelter in place than San Francisco. So that's why we're here.
Wow, that's amazing.
What's the secret to beekeeping? Like,
Beekeeping
what's
is
the
wild.
headline?
It's crazy. I got like photos of me in the whole like spacesuit,
Oh man, I
whatever,
love
and
it.
like, yeah, I think the most important thing is just stay calm. I think bees can like smell your fear, and they will come after you if you're concerned. And like, I think my first time was pretty rough. I got a couple stings, but then every time thereafter, no matter how like thick or hairy it gets, like, you just like breathe, stay calm, like you'll be fine, and then they're fine. They chill out when you chill out.
Yeah, cool.
So Nancy was taking my wife was taking a beekeeping class right as COVID happened. I think it was like a 6-part class.
Wow.
She only did the first one, and then this happened. And she was like, I think I'm going to get some bees. She's like, I already took the first class. I pretty much know everything.
Do you have laws in, you're in Lexington? Do you have
Yeah.
laws about like your neighbors? You have to get your neighbors' permission?
I'm actually not sure what the laws are. I believe that as just to be a good neighbor, you should get everyone's permission. But we actually elected to get chickens instead. So
Great.
That's where we're headed. So she did not take a chicken keeping class, but she has gone to the ends of the internet to figure that out.
Yeah, we have chickens here as well, and they're pretty easy. You just, like you feed them your food scraps and you're good.
Yeah, I hope so. So how are things in California? I feel like, they've definitely been best in class in the United States. What's the thinking there in terms of when they're going to open the economy back up, and what's the thinking on how to avoid like a rebound like, we saw in Singapore and Hong Kong and some of these other places?
Yeah, it's funny, like it has been kind of great. Like my ex-wife is in the medical industry. I was talking to her recently, and she was saying that, while the hospitals are definitely deferring a lot of the non urgent cases, basically anything elective, and anything that can be deferred, for a short period of time is just not happening surgically. So, the hospitals have capacity. Their ICUs are not overwhelmed. It's pretty impressive. And yeah, numbers in terms of like, new cases you were setting earlier, new cases per 100,000, it's been mostly fine. But as to like when to reopen or anything like that, I think the reason why it's been fine has been a combination of being really proactive up front and shutting things down, mostly inspired by, say, Stripe or Twitter, or I think maybe Palantir as well, being really proactive in doing work from home from their companies, which kind of set a precedent for London Breed in San Francisco to close things down earlier than other governors, and then Gavin Newsom following suit roughly like a week or two later. But I don't know how you unwind in the other direction. Like, are we going to then look to the tech companies again for some form of leadership? Like, I think they won due to conservatism. So I don't think they're going to be the first to move out of it. And I think work from home actually kind of works for their business model. Whereas, like retail or, like anything that requires like brick and mortar, atoms, whatever, like they're really hurt. They need to get back in business much sooner than the tech companies need their employees back in offices. So I don't know how California unwinds more successfully than the way that they like wound down. In fact, we might be a trailing adopter in that way. But I loved the dystopian nature of the Western pacts, Western state pacts. You see this? This is crazy.
No.
Like nation states emerging. So like
Yeah.
apparently like Gavin Newsom and then like the mayor or the governor in Oregon and I think it was like Washington as well have formed this alliance that like they're going to make decisions together, and it seems like so sci-fi to me that we're like coming up with like renegade forms of government to protect against like the federal state.
Well, it makes sense though if you're contiguous states too, right? Because
Yeah.
the borders are porous, so having some sort of coordination makes sense.
Yeah, no,
Although
I think
theoretically,
it's practical.
everything is contiguous if you go far enough.
Yeah, that's true, and it just felt so sci-fi to me. Like it reminds me of these like future novels where like boundaries get defined politically. Boundaries get defined politically in a way that like I don't know, just like looks like a distant future, and yet it's happening like right now.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about the funding environment. So last week we chatted a bit about how we saw seed funding evolving in light of the pandemic and what's going to be a recession the next couple of years. Let's chat a bit about what we think about Series A financing and how Series A and Series B funds are likely to be reacting. And I know that internally we have some diverging opinions here. I don't know. I don't know if anybody wants to kick off and just share their point of view.
So I think
I
we
had
can
a, okay.
okay, go ahead,
Sure,
Billy.
Dave, go. So I, maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, I shared a hypothesis, which is if we continue to be working from home for the next 3 to 6 months as VCs, I actually feel like Series A firms might start doing more seed deals because in theory, they can see these as slightly lower bar. They might not feel comfortable not meeting in person for a Series A investment, but they might feel comfortable doing more of seed deals. That's not to say I don't think the volume is going to like 10x, but if the average Series A firm who previously did like 2 of these a year, they might do like 4 or 5. So that was my hypothesis. But
I think the counter argument is that VPs and Series A firms are, first of all, they're like spending a lot of time triaging their own portfolio. And then, I think there's probably an argument that maybe internally, hey, you should retreat to your knitting, do what you're kind of supposed to be doing, which is Series A investments. And then I even think, I know a lot of firms are very political inside of them. And so like, if you're going to champion an investment in front of your colleagues, are you going to use up that political capital now for a small little, relatively speaking, seed investment versus, saving that political capital for when you actually really want to spend it and it's an investment that's going to matter to you?
Yeah, a third potential strategy is to say, well, we've been in an environment with inflated prices for quite a while. There are going to be a number of businesses that are probably really good businesses, but maybe short-term, like pretty impaired and pretty desperate. And maybe this is a great time to do a Series B investment or to tag on top of a existing Series A with a partner that and like, and get, sort of take advantage of this opportunity. I feel like that did not happen very much in the last recession. And I don't know if there's a great example of firms that did take that approach and were successful, but theoretically you would think that in a market like this, if you have capital and the aggressiveness to find good companies, that there could be some value to be had. So I don't know, those are 3 different points of view. Andrew, what's the answer?
I definitely don't have the answer, but you're talking about like what would they do differently in terms of like size of round or pacing, during this period of time. I did do at one point, this is old, so I'm going to be dusty in recovering it, but I did do like a quantitative analysis of Series A firm deal pacing in the kind of like, 3-year window prior to the '08 crisis and then kind of like '08 onward to see like, well, what actually happened to deal pacing. And I found like very little correlation amongst firms. Like some firms, started really leaning in and doing a bunch more deals, and other firms, significantly dialed their pace back. I think Sequoia often being thought of as like a standard in the industry for quality, was quite consistent and did some amazing deals in that kind of 08, 09 timeframe, like Airbnb and Dropbox, and I think they even made their investment into Y Combinator at that point, which is pretty crazy. But yeah, so I don't know what will actually happen in this cycle, because I think we're talking about like a decade later, and it's just so different. But I could think if I were still in an investing role at a firm, I agree with Dave when you're talking about like, how do you deal with your political capital, like trying to convince partners, like, these partnerships, they do require a little bit of navigation. And so you want to make sure that your bullets count. So, seed is something that is very tempting because it helps fill the top of the funnel, but that's like a great strategy for when, you're really trying to see like a wide breadth of deals and deploy a lot of capital over a period of time. Whereas if you think you're going to be more measured or conservative with your decisions, I think you're going to do them with higher conviction, higher certainty, therefore probably a little bit later stage with the intention of more dollars to work, so that company's very well capitalized, hopefully leveraging other people's capital in the round as well. So you're in a less risky position.
Yeah, and there's probably less time pressure as well. So you have more time to like build that conviction that you're talking about, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know though, like, perhaps what'll happen is the capital will just concentrate towards a smaller number of really, really attractive companies, and, time pressure will still be really high, prices will still be really high, and, most funds will just do fewer deals. If they can't win those, they'll just feel like, well, I can just hang back and not feel too much pressure to deploy and go slow.
Yeah,
I remember the benchmark round into Twitter. I think it was like maybe 09, could be 10, but I think it was 09. And Fred Wilson turned to me at one point, and he was like, this is what it looks like when a hot deal gets done in a down market. And because he had lived through it in, kind of 2000, 2001, and it was a feeding frenzy. It was like really aggressive. I think it was like IVP versus benchmark trying to elbow each other out, and ended in like a compromise where each got some of the round, but then like benchmark got the board seat. And so like IVP had to take like deferential positioning. It was just such a knife fight. And there was other parties at the table, but those are the two that ultimately mattered in the end.
Well, I think IVP did it at $1 billion like 3 months later.
Is that what it was? Yeah,
I
it was
think that was
something
right.
Like shockingly messy. And so, yeah, I think you're right. Like in downtimes, hot deals in a way get like, white hot, lightning hot, because like you want to do something, you have to deploy the capital, and you want to do something that you feel really good about. And so you don't want to lose that opportunity when you see it, because in a down market, you're just gonna be more skeptical in general.
Were there any things that you saw at USV during that time that you kind of stored away for the future in terms of, how to invest, or even among the portfolio company founders, like how to manage, during times of uncertainty? Not to say that 08 is going to be similar to this situation, but curious if there's any lessons learned that you picked up during that time.
I mean, what did we do? We told all our companies to renegotiate, any major contract they had, because we thought there was gonna be flexibility there. We told them if they were in any bank that was like a smaller bank that was in the news as concerning, like consider moving all your cash elsewhere. Notably, that list included SVB and Square One. So a lot of people that were doing banking because of venture relations, we were saying like, no, like move to Wells Fargo temporarily or something like that. And then we had to navigate a couple companies through both layoffs and down rounds as well. But I think that's like the usual playbook. I don't think there's anything particularly exceptional about this downturn versus a prior downturn, and what we're going to do particularly differently or not. I mean, it feels really weird, the macro environment, it being like a virus causing this issue. And that can be scary or create more fear. But I think the general playbook about preserve cash, like manage headcount, like all that stuff is still valid advice.
So that we have a question from from somebody. Has anyone heard rumors about the federal government developing grants for startups or creating a super fund that financial institutions can make investments into? I haven't.
The only thing I saw was somebody talking about loosening the local rule about having banks being able to invest in startups.
Yeah, I hear that's coming. I heard that was coming independent of COVID, and I heard the time frame was this summer.
Yeah, then I heard it might be get accelerated because of the COVID stuff, which makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to make a big difference anyway. So.
Yeah, well, that in combination with no longer any reserve requirements at these large banks, which might be a temporary window, right? Like maybe the SEC will lock that back down, but no reserve requirements and a loosening the Rockler rule, like that would be quite a 1-2 punch in terms of liquidity from large banks for startups.
Yeah.
So another thing that was in the news, or at least on my Twitter feed, was Carta did a round of layoffs. Not huge. I think like 16% of their workforce. Their CEO wrote, I thought, an excellent letter outlining sort of his thought process and the moral conflict that he had, both as needing to satisfy the needs of shareholders and also the human element of the benefit of their employees. Generally, I would say the response is pretty positive. On the flip side, there was some eyebrows that were turned around, the fact that they had raised a ton of money. There's some news that, they're probably in the market for another large financing round. And I know, Andrew, you don't have, you have the same information as everybody at this point, but just curious, like, what's your point of view on that situation? And maybe more abstractly, like the idea of doing layoffs for a company that is doing quite well when they have a lot of capital, but it's still financially responsible, I guess, to be reduced doing a RIF. Like, just how do you think through that quandary?
Well, I mean, I think when you think about the larger boards that you all sit on, you're approving a plan somewhere around the kind of like November, December timeframe, and there's going to be staffing associated with that year's coming plan. Let's say goal is just double growth, double ARR or something like that. And you're going to have to hire a bunch of salespeople up front in order to be able to hit those numbers because they have to ramp into quota. You're not going to be able to do it with the same team. In order to hire those salespeople, you're going to need support for the people. They're also going to mean additional customers. So, there's going to be more kind of, CS requirements, probably be like recruiters associated with, hiring all these folks, and all that, rolls out of that plan. So then let's say you get into the year and it's February, it's March, and there's a significant replan event. Like, I don't know about you, but as a director of that company, I'd really want to see A, what the replan looks like, and then B, if you're talking about substantially different growth, you should scale headcount to match the new mission. I don't think you should have a bunch of like sales folks that are going to be now under quota if they're lucky. You're just setting them up for failure, and then additional costs associated with that, which hurts all shareholders, including the employees, including the ex-employees. So I heard layoffs. I'm like, I think that's.
What was that?
When I heard layoffs, I think that's a great decision in general for any high growth company, because I think that they had probably previously staffed against a plan that just is moot. Like it's no longer relevant. As for raising a lot of capital, I would love your guys' take on this, because I think of it as super orthogonal. Like I just think of it as another good thing to do in a down market if there is, appetite for equity in your business, right? Like if you can raise a war chest, like that's great. You have a lot of advantages. It means your stock is going to be worth more, so you can use that equity in paper to go out and make acquisitions. It does a little bit of like a scorched earth strategy against competitors in your wake also trying to raise capital. It improves your credit worthiness. It improves like just security for the business. So like if I'm in their shoes and I have the ability to raise a bunch more capital, I'm definitely going to do that. It isn't necessarily going to stop me from making the right decisions for staffing the business for the current environment. I don't know. Do I sound too heartless? Like, am I totally like Montgomery Burns here?
We're heartless venture capitalists, Andrew. You're retired, so like, you can be you can be more like kumbaya, I think.
Well, I'm an endless cheerleader for the company. I mean, I bleed
Yeah.
card blue, so it's hard for me to ever take a position otherwise. Just speak my own book. But I genuinely believe what I'm saying. Like, I really think that the prudent thing to do through this environment would be to raise as much as you could if it's available to you. Don't distract yourself with raising if you can't. But yeah, raise as much as you can if it's available to you in order to weather the storm. And then, make sure that the people who are on the boat with you are the right people for the next phase of the mission, and don't overpack the boat if you can avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
Are you advising your portfolio similarly?
To raise capital. I mean, I think if capital is available, it's a great time to shore up the balance sheet. I think if it's not readily available, it's a tough time to be seeking it out. So it's a little bit of a haves and have-nots kind of environment, I'd say. I mean, I feel like this is the kind of thing that, when you're an investor and you think about things from as sort of like a shareholder at the enterprise level, I agree with you that it's reasonably straightforward, right? When times have changed and plans have changed. It's just funny at this moment where the dissonance is greater because it's such a human problem. And so, the kind of mainstream news headline of company is laying people off, but has tons of money and is going to raise way more money at a higher valuation. Like, it makes you think, like, do we have it wrong as with our capitalist hat on? I don't know. It's interesting to think about. I think for sure, right? Like, based on the responses on that I read, I think you hear opinions in both directions. But we are in a little bit of a capitalist and especially venture capitalist echo chamber, and so it's helpful to think about the alternative view.
I can think of board meetings I've been in where we'll be starting 40 new employees in the quarter, like a huge number or something like that. But the net new employees is only like low single digits or something like that. It's because there's just significant turnover in the business. And so long as the business is growing well and that turnover isn't a sign of cracks in the ship, I kind of like that. Like, I think that startups are not indentured servitude, and so people should be leaving, continuing their career and in different trajectories, particularly in good times. And then for those employees that you did hire, you're not always going to hire, right? You probably have some portion of your employee base on a PIP at any given time, and I don't know, maybe I'm coming off heartless or something like that, but it's the classic, like, Rahm Emanuel, don't let a good crisis go to waste. It sounds like Carter's making two moves I see as somewhat orthogonal, but I can see how they'd overlap and create that optics that are both taking advantage of the crisis, the ability to raise capital when there's interest in a hot deal, and to make sure that the team is the right makeup.
Yeah. I had one comment on my Twitter post on this that was like, well, how much does that really save, right? Like, in the scheme of things, it's a relatively small amount of capital. And my response to that was like, well, would you feel better if they laid off like 50% of their staff? Like, that seems kind of strange.
I mean, so the point related to that, Rob, is regardless of the size of the cut, if you have a cut, it's going to impact morale and culture, and that is tricky to manage. So, like, if they didn't really save a ton of burn, there is a decision to be made, like, as if whether that's even worthwhile, right? Because how does that impact your long-term morale and ability to retain your best players or second best players? Because I mean, it's just a very hard thing to deal with internally as an employee.
Yeah, totally. Although I would say 16% is material, right? I just felt like the magnitude, I understand the point, but it didn't quite make sense to me, with the magnitudes that we were talking about there. What else should we talk about? What are some things that you've learned, Andrew, looking back in your venture capital career? Share some wisdom of, like, maybe things you've learned from the firms you've been at, or maybe things you've seen from other firms that you weren't at that you really admired. Yeah.
Now, what have I learned? I mean, look, my negative one day, the day I interviewed or whatever at Union Square Ventures back in '06. It was the summer of '06. I only got asked a single question in that interview, and it lasted 45 minutes. We just debated the one question the whole time. And it was, do you think that the mobile web will ever be, as good, if not better, than the desktop web? And I don't remember the timing, but the iPhone didn't launch until 2007. Steve Jobs got up on stage basically 1 year later from my interview. It was like summer 2007, and held up, the iPhone with like NewYorkTimes.com and scrolling on it. It was gorgeous. It was amazing. It was easily as good as the desktop web. But when I got asked that question in 2006, just literally 1 year prior, I answered it no with strong conviction. It took me a while to form the answer, but I said no. And it's because at the time the cutting edge for mobile browsing was like BlackBerry, and I had a Nintendo DS that was really much more effective device because it had twice the screen real estate of the BlackBerry, and it too had just like a really god awful web browsing experience. So I just thought like it's never gonna get better because we would have to rebuild the web from scratch effectively for mobile purposes, and I didn't see us doing that in any reasonable time frame. And if I'm going to take like one lesson away from venture, from like fast forward 13, 14 years later or whatever, I should have just said yes and found a way to say yes, because I think VCs are much better optimists than pessimists.
Yeah.
So like I'm very grateful that I got the job, but I think I answered the question dead wrong. Like you should start from the things will always get better mind frame, and then kind of like, try and figure out, well, why are they going to get better, or how's it going to work, or whatever. And like a VC who's an optimist is a better VC in a board meeting, is a better VC gaining conviction to make the investment. Like go optimism.
Mm-hmm. The challenge is that I feel like it is a job that breeds pessimism.
Yeah.
You're saying no all day long. What was that?
I agree with you if you let the grind get to you. Yeah.
I heard somebody once describe Felda Hardiman at Bessemer, and the description was he always talks himself into the deal. So when and I actually noticed this, like when he's in a meeting, he is like trying to parrot back what you're saying in an optimistic light so that he's convincing himself that that is true. But then I think he talks himself out of it later, because obviously he doesn't, it's not like he says yes all the time, but I actually have always appreciated that kind of mindset. I think entrepreneurs definitely appreciate it. Although what it does is it creates a little of the jarring effect of like, oh yeah, that investor loved it. They loved us when we were pitching them. And then next thing you know, they ghost you, or they say no abruptly, and you're like, wait, what happened?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about slightly orthogonal issues. One is like quality of communication, and then the other is enthusiasm or optimism. And you definitely don't want to whipsaw entrepreneurs. So I totally agree with that. But like if you can yes and in a pitch meeting and kind of lean forward and get engaged, like you're going to have a better meeting as the investor. Like you're just going to have more fun with it, and it's going to be like a more enjoyable experience. The entrepreneur maybe is going to get something out of that process because like if you're lucky, you'll provide an insight or two that might be a different angle on something that they hadn't thought of, rather than just sitting there and consuming the information, filleting what you need off of it in order to make a good investment decision. I'm sure you could be a good investor doing that. It just sounds kind of boring to me.
Were there any things that you've seen like optimistic investors do to just like maintain their optimism, avoid the grind?
Yeah, I remember a conversation between Bijan and another investor. I'll leave nameless, whatever. But they were talking about this exact issue, and the other guy was like, "Oh, I'm just so frustrated. I just spent like 3 months like deeply researching the space, and I ultimately came to like no on every single company, and I just feel like I'm at square one, and this is so frustrating." And Bijan just had like this really great positive reframing for it, and instead was like, "No, you just got 3 months smarter on a topic, and now you have a prepared mind, so that when the right deal or the right entrepreneur comes through the door, not only are you going to be able to identify that quickly, but you're going to be the best investor for that person in that space." And like that would be an amazing positive reframe if you could really fully embrace that after what would feel like spinning your wheels for a big chunk of a year. So I like that, and I tried to keep that in mind throughout my career, because I heard it fairly early in my time in Spark. Because But yeah, I do think that that's not something that's going to be like unique to Bijan. Like, I'm not surprised that Bijan said that, because he is just generally a very optimistic person and like a very pleasant person to like be around and you know, shoot the shit with. So it's not surprising it would come from him. There might just be something like more core, like a confounding variable above, which is just like, he's optimistic.
Yeah. Interesting. Well,
Do you have that dynamic within your partnership? Like, is there someone that is perennially optimistic more so than others?
Lee?
Well, I think we have different.
We all are, yeah, but
we have
yeah.
different decision-making processes. Some people, you know, start optimistic but part of their process is, you know, it's just to whittle away. And then, you know, some people start skeptical and kind of build conviction over time. You know, I think of one person that kind of tries on a couple different hats and sees which one kind of fits right. And so,
yeah,
I think we have inside our partnership, we have kind of diverse processes getting to, which I think, you know, trying to get to the truth.
And is anyone the devil's advocate in the room that's like generally trying to make sure that there isn't too much momentum of conviction all in one direction? Like that might scare that person.
I think actually different people have taken that role at different times, both in the life of the firm and for certain types of businesses.
Yeah.
And certain types of founders. So I think there's some checks and balances. We don't have, you know, I think it's Andreessen where they actually assign somebody to be the skeptic in any one investment, and like that's their job to elevate the thinking, which I think, you know, there's some value in that. We don't do it in such a formal way, but there are certain, you know, there's certain types of founders.
There's no one grumpy Gus in the corner though.
Yeah. What's funny is that you can usually anticipate, you know, like for a particular investment opportunity, you're like, you almost preface it as like, okay, this is one that so-and-so is going to hate. And let me just tell you about it. And then like step back and let that person say what you know they're going to say. So I don't know. In a way, I actually wonder if, because we've been at it together for a long time, and Melody's been newer with us, but she's integrated really easily. I wonder if it's actually a problem that we can anticipate each other's objections or enthusiasm too easily. But I don't know. So far, it's led to pretty healthy harmony but still pretty elevated discussions, I'd say.
There was a pretty successful entrepreneur that Spark backed, who I'm leaving him nameless because it's kind of a weird story, but when he would pitch, he'd always stand up in front of the room, which was always a little bit uncomfortable for everyone. He's like really like takes it, you know, very showy, presenting, whatever. And he'd start every pitch with, here are the 4 reasons why you should not do this deal. And he just lists off the 4 worst qualities of exactly the company that he wanted to build and all the reasons why he can't do it. Then, all right, we're good. Those are the 4 reasons. Yeah. Got it. Okay, let's start the pitch. And so then you like get into it. And then as you're like, you know, 15 minutes into it, you're like, hey, but you know, so-and-so, what about like, you know, your CAC issues here? Like, I don't know this. He's like, oh, wait, that was one of the 4. Like we already talked about, like, if you think that this is a reason not to do this deal, pass now. That was one of the 4. So it's like anticipating concerns is just good showmanship.
Was that relatively effective, would you say?
Spark funded the founder, so it worked.
And did he repeat that playbook like in other fundraisers?
It's a person who his first company was quite successful, and then the company that we funded wasn't. So I don't know. It might be a good fundraising technique. I don't know whether or not it necessarily leads to good business building. Yeah.
That is true. Those two things are often not correlated.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Andrew. It's so fun to hang out. I'm glad that you're willing to do this. We try to keep these to about 45 minutes. So it's really great to see you. I'm envious of where you are and your farm lifestyle. It's pretty
crazy.
awesome.
I have all the freedom in the world. It's beautiful here. So look, I mean, I'm very lucky. I know how lucky I am, given the context of the pandemic we're all dealing with. But I'm trying to take advantage of it while I have it. It's really great.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye, thank you.